Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. So, where are you watching it from? And what are you doing right now? I hope you're sitting back in a comfy spot, maybe wrapped up in a soft blanket, letting the gentle hum of the world fade away as you prepare for a calming escape. Tonight, I have a special story for you, a mystery that unfolds on a rainy night, where secrets are hidden and every shadow carries a story. It's a tale that will draw you in, slowly, like a fog settling over a quiet street. So take a deep breath, let go of the day, and let your mind drift into the soothing rhythm of the rain outside as we begin. This is the story of the last cigarette on 5th Street. The rain was heavy that night, more relentless than usual, as if the sky itself were trying to wash away the filth of the world. You could hear it drumming against the window of your small office, a steady rhythm that almost felt like a lullaby. But it wasn't peaceful. The sound, while calming to some, always reminded you of the cases left unsolved, the people who disappeared into the shadows, and the truths that couldn't be uncovered. Your office had seen better days. The wooden desk, now covered in layers of dust, had once held files and case notes, but now it stood as a forgotten relic of a life spent chasing ghosts. The leather chair creaked under the weight of your tired body as you leaned back and closed your eyes, hoping for a few moments of peace before you finally closed the door to this life for good. You had decided this would be your last case. For months, maybe even years, you'd been telling yourself you were done, that it was time to retire, to let someone younger take over the torch. The city had changed, and you had changed with it. Your knees creaked when you walked, and your hands trembled slightly when you held a pen. You were no longer the sharp detective you once were, the one who could read your room with a single glance, who could follow a trail of clues until they all led to the truth. No, now you were just a tired old man sitting in a cramped office, staring out the window at the rain and thinking about all the times you had tried to leave but kept coming back. But tonight was different. There was a knock on the door, so soft you almost missed it, a sound that barely cut through the steady patter of rain. You opened your eyes slowly, the movement feeling foreign as you sat upright. The knock came again, more insistent this time. You stood, your joints protesting the movement, and walked to the door, your hand pausing just before the handle. A part of you wanted to ignore it, to let whoever was on the other side knock until they gave up, but there was another part of you, the old part, that couldn't resist. You opened the door to find a man standing in the rain, his face obscured by the brim of a worn fedora. He was tall, his frame hunched slightly as if the weight of something heavy pressed down on him. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at you. His eyes were shadowed, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of you spoke, and the rain seemed to fill the space between you, a barrier you both couldn't cross. "I need your help," the man said finally, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. You raised an eyebrow, the familiar jolt of curiosity running through you. It had been a while since anyone had come to you with a case. Most people had forgotten about you, or worse, they didn't think you were worth hiring anymore. You were just a relic of a time when detectives like you mattered. But here he was, standing in the doorway, asking for your help. Something about the way he stood there told you this wasn't just another random case. This was different. "Come in," you said, stepping aside to let him in. He didn't hesitate, crossing the threshold quickly and brushing past you. He smelled faintly of cigarettes and cologne, the kind that used to linger in your own office before it all came to an end. The man didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood by the window, his back to you as he stared out at the rain. It was as if the storm outside held the answer to whatever was eating at him, and he was waiting for it to reveal itself. You watched him for a moment, taking in the way his shoulders were tense, like he was carrying something heavier than just his own weight. Then, he turned to face you, his eyes meeting yours. "I didn't know who else to turn to," he said, his voice lower now, like he was afraid someone might hear. "There's been a murder. A bad one. And I don't think anyone else can solve it." You took a seat behind your desk, studying him closely. He looked nervous, his hands twitching at his sides like he didn't quite know what to do with them. His lips were dry, and you could see the way he swallowed, as if the words he was about to say were stuck in his throat. You'd seen this before, people who had something they were trying to say but couldn't quite get it out. The fear was palpable, and that only made you more interested. "Tell me about the murder," you said, leaning back in your chair and crossing your arms. Your eyes never left his. For a moment, the man hesitated again, glancing toward the window as if the rain might somehow give him the courage he needed. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, like he couldn't hold them in any longer. "A woman. Found dead in an alley off 5th Street. No witnesses. No clues. Just her body. And the strange thing is, there's no sign of a struggle. No forced entry. Nothing that says she was attacked. But she's dead, Detective. And someone needs to know why." You sat quietly, letting the silence stretch between you. 5th Street. The name hit you like a punch in the gut. That was your street. Your stomping grounds. You'd walked that same stretch of road 1,000 times over the years, through rainstorms and sunshine, through the good cases and the bad ones. It was the street that had seen more than its fair share of crime, more than its fair share of broken people. But this felt different. "Who is she?" you asked, your voice steady now, despite the way your heart was beating faster than usual. The rain outside seemed to pick up again, the sound growing louder in the stillness of the room. The man shifted uncomfortably, his gaze faltering. "Her name was Clara. Clara James. She was connected to people who aren't easy to get close to. And now she's dead. But the weird thing is, no one's talking about it. The police, they're not looking for the killer. They just wanted to go away." You leaned forward in your chair, the weight of his words settling in your chest. You had no idea who Clara James was, but you could tell she was more than just a name. She was a piece of something bigger, something dangerous, and whoever killed her didn't want it known. "I'll take the case," you said finally, your voice low but sure. "But this is the last one, you understand? After this, I'm done." The man nodded, relief washing over his face. "I understand, Detective. And thank you. I knew you'd be the one to help." As he turned to leave, you sat back in your chair, the rain still falling heavily outside. You were tired. You were ready to walk away. But something about this case, something about the way the man had looked at you, made you feel like this wasn't just another cold case. This was the one that would close the door on your career, one way or another. And so, as the storm raged on outside, you made your way to 5th Street. It was the start of your last journey as a detective. The city's heartbeat slowed to a murmur as you stepped out of the office and into the night. The rain wasn't just falling, it was pouring, relentless, as if trying to cleanse the streets of the sins that had soaked into them over the years. The smell of wet asphalt and the damp, cold air wrapped around you, mingling with the faint scent of cigarette smoke still lingering on your clothes. It was familiar, comforting in a way, even though you hadn't been outside on a case like this for some time. Your feet hit the wet pavement, and your worn shoes made little sound, the rain drowning out the rhythm of your steps. You didn't need to hurry. In fact, there was no urgency at all. The rain was your ally, softening the edges of the world, making it all feel like a dream, a place where nothing truly mattered but the present moment. The streetlights cast a dull, yellow glow, illuminating puddles that reflected the hazy sky. A quiet fog had begun to roll in from the river, wrapping around the buildings like a blanket. You looked up, watching as the rainwater slid down the sides of the buildings, pooling around your ankles. The world felt empty, silent. But you knew better than to mistake silence for peace. There was a tension in the air, a quiet that wasn't really quiet at all. It was filled with the weight of secrets, buried deep in the cracks of the street, in the corners of the alleys. You didn't even need to check the address. You knew exactly where to go. Fifth Street had always been your territory. Not because it was any better or worse than the other parts of town, but because it was a place where things happened quietly. It wasn't the flashy kind of crime you read about in the papers. No, Fifth Street was home to the kind of stories you didn't hear about. The ones that disappeared with the morning fog, hidden beneath layers of gossip, swept away by the next storm. It was the kind of street that gave birth to ghosts, people and things that had been forgotten, buried in the rush of everyday life. You crossed the intersection, heading toward the alley the man had described. As you walked, you could feel the weight of the city pressing down on you. Every step was a reminder of how much time you'd spent chasing ghosts, cases that never quite added up, people who didn't exist anymore, or worse, people who never existed at all. The world had changed, but you hadn't, not really. The same old faces stared back at you from the dark windows of closed shops, the same shadows stretched across the sidewalks. It was all so familiar. But tonight, something felt different. Clara James wasn't just another name. Something in her death didn't sit right, even though you didn't know her, didn't know who she had been, or what had led to her end. You reached the mouth of the alley and stopped, letting your eyes adjust to the dim light. It was just as the man had described, dark, silent, a place where the echoes of the past seemed to linger. The smell of decay was thick in the air, a cocktail of wet concrete, rotting garbage, and the faintest trace of something metallic. The alley itself was narrow, the walls on either side towering above you, closing you in like a maze. At the far end, where the light from the street barely reached, you could just make out the outline of something on the ground. A shape. A body. And despite the rain, despite the way it blurred everything around you, you knew that it was Clara. You didn't need to get close to know she was dead. You'd seen death too many times to mistake it for anything else. The posture of her body was wrong. Too still. Too rigid. You could almost hear the silence of the space around you, heavy and thick. It was the kind of silence that came with a bad death, one that had been too quick, too clean. There was no mess, no struggle. Nothing that screamed out for attention. The body was the only thing that spoke in this place, and even it was whispering. You could almost hear her calling out to you, but only just. You move forward, cautiously, your footsteps muffled by the wet ground. Your mind, despite the years of experience, was scrambling for answers, trying to make sense of the absence of evidence. The body itself was oddly pristine, not the kind of victim who had fought for their life, not the kind who had screamed out in terror. No, Clara James had died without a fight, without even a struggle, which, in your line of work, was always a red flag. It wasn't common. Even the most practiced killers left something behind. A sign. A clue. A trail. But here, there was nothing. Just her, lying there as though someone had placed her in that exact position, deliberately, carefully. You crouched down beside her, trying to ignore the cold dampness seeping through your clothes. The rain was still falling in sheets, washing away any trace of evidence that might have been left behind. Her eyes were closed, but there was something about the way her lashes lay against her skin that struck you as unnatural. There was no fear in her face, no mark of panic. Just an emptiness, as though her life had been snuffed out with little more than a thought. You touched her wrist gently, feeling for a pulse, but there was nothing. The body was cold, too cold to have been lying there for long. Her death had been swift, efficient. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. You stood up again, taking a step back to survey the scene. There was no blood on the ground, no sign of a struggle. There was nothing here to suggest that this had been a crime of passion or even a violent confrontation. It was too clean, too perfect. Just like the rest of the city, a place where everything was hidden, swept away by the next rainstorm, the next shadow, the next secret. You ran a hand through your hair, the wet strands clinging to your fingers. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the kind of death that had an explanation, at least, not one that you could find so easily. You had no suspect, no motive, no witness. Just a body in the rain. A name. Clara James. But you had a feeling, deep down, that there was more to this than met the eye. The way the man had looked at you when he asked for your help, the urgency in his voice, told you that Clara's death wasn't just another statistic. Someone, somewhere, was trying to bury this, to make it disappear like so many others. But you wouldn't let it. You glanced around, taking in the alley one last time before you turned and walked back toward the street. The rain had intensified, the downpour now soaking through your coat and clinging to your skin. You needed to get to the bottom of this, and fast. There was something more at play here, something lurking just beneath the surface. But for now, you had to follow the one lead you had, the mysterious man who had brought you here. You disappeared into the night, the rain washing away your footprints as if they never existed. But you knew that the mystery of Clara James wouldn't be so easily erased. The rain hadn't stopped. It never did when the city needed a cleansing, and tonight, the downpour seemed like nature itself trying to erase the sins of the past. The streets were slick, reflecting the dim streetlights as if they were trapped in a forgotten dream. The city felt distant in a way, its edges blurred by the rain, the fog, and the weight of unanswered questions that clung to the air. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, every shadow a story that only the rain could understand. You stood at the mouth of the alley where Clara James had been found, looking over your shoulder toward the narrow passage. The body had been removed by the time you returned to the scene, but the sense of coldness lingered, hanging in the air like a fog you couldn't quite shake off. The remnants of her presence felt more like a whisper than a memory, a feeling that seemed to echo in the emptiness around you. You turned back to face the street. Your coat was soaked, your boots heavy with water as you strode toward the corner where the city's pulse seemed to beat louder. People passed by, unaware of the ghosts lingering just beneath the surface, as if the rain had washed them away into oblivion. But you knew better. You knew the city's secrets never really went anywhere. They just hid, waiting for the right person to uncover them. The man's words echoed in your mind. She was connected to people who aren't easy to get close to. Connected to whom? And why hadn't anyone else bothered to look into her death? It didn't sit right with you. No one had even bothered to send a patrol car to the scene. It wasn't like the city to be so indifferent to a life lost, even one as quietly as Clara's. No, something was off here, and you were starting to suspect that the rain wasn't the only thing trying to wash everything away. You headed toward the nearest diner. It was the kind of place where the coffee was strong, the waitresses knew your name, and the booths offered a quiet corner where you could think without being bothered. The bell above the door jingled softly as you entered, the warmth from the inside immediately pressing against the chill that had settled in your bones. The place was nearly empty, just a few old-timers nursing their mugs of coffee at the counter, their faces lined with time. They barely noticed you as you slid into a booth in the back, the worn vinyl creaking under your weight. You ordered a coffee and sat back, looking out the window at the rain. Your mind kept returning to Clara's body, her lifeless eyes, the strange stillness in the alley. No blood. No sign of a struggle. A body that had been carefully placed, almost with reverence. This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone had planned it. But why her? What had she known, or who had she been, that made her a target? The waitress brought your coffee, and you took a sip, the bitter warmth spreading through you. You didn't mind the quiet here. In fact, you welcomed it. The noise of the city, the constant hum of activity, had always grated on you. This was different. This was the kind of peace you could find only when you were alone with your thoughts, away from the distractions and the false faces people put on in public. You let your eyes wander to the clock on the wall. Time was something you didn't have much of these days, but tonight it seemed to stretch. You had been out on the case for hours, and yet the pieces didn't fit. There was a pattern, you were sure of it, but it wasn't clear yet. You thought of the man, the one who had come to you for help. There was something about him that you couldn't quite put your finger on. Something that made you wonder whether he was telling you the whole truth. Maybe Clara had been connected to someone important, but was that the whole story? Or was he hiding something from you? You leaned back in the booth, letting your mind wander. The hum of the diner, the clink of silverware, and the occasional chatter from the counter were all drowned out by the thoughts racing in your head. Every instinct told you to go after the man, to find out exactly who he was and why he'd sought you out. But that wasn't how things worked in your line of work. You followed the clues, not the people. And right now, the only clue you had was Clara herself. You took another sip of coffee, the heat offering some comfort, though the chill in your bones remained. Something was missing from the picture, something that didn't add up. The way Clara had been placed so carefully in the alley, it suggested someone with a certain amount of control, someone who had planned this moment with precision. But why leave the body in such a public place? Why not dispose of it in a way that didn't attract attention? You stood up suddenly, the answer coming to you in a flash. The rain had been a blessing for whoever was behind this. It had erased any trace of evidence, wiped away any clues that might have been left behind. The body, left so deliberately in the alley, was an invitation to the police to look the other way. But the truth was, the killer hadn't cared whether the body was found or not. It wasn't about covering up the crime, it was about sending a message. A message that only someone like you, someone who had seen it all before, would understand. He dropped some change on the table, enough to cover the coffee, and left the diner without a word. The night had already swallowed the streets again, the sound of the rain almost deafening now. You moved with purpose, your feet slapping against the pavement as you made your way back to the alley. There was something about this case, something about the way the pieces didn't fit together, that gnawed at you. You needed to see the place again, needed to get a clearer picture of what had happened. By the time you arrived at the alley, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. The streetlights reflected off the wet ground, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward you. You didn't go straight to the spot where Clara had been found. Instead, you walked slowly, methodically, letting your eyes roam over the familiar cracks in the concrete, the peeling paint on the buildings, the garbage strewn in the corners. Everything was just as you remembered it, the same as it had always been. But now, there was something different. There was a weight in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. It was as if the alley itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. You crouched down near the spot where Clara had been. There was nothing now, no trace of her body, no evidence of what had happened. The rain had done its work, erasing all signs of the past. But that didn't stop you from searching. You moved along the ground carefully, your eyes scanning every inch, looking for something, anything that might give you a clue. And then, in the dim light, you saw it, a faint scuff mark in the wet concrete, barely noticeable but enough to make your heart race. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was something. A clue. A sign that the trail hadn't completely vanished. You knelt down, tracing the mark with your finger, your mind already racing. Whoever had placed Clara's body here hadn't been as careful as they thought. They had left something behind, a trace of their presence. This was no longer just about Clara's death. It was about the person who had killed her and the message they had tried so hard to bury. The rain continued to fall, but for you, it no longer seemed like a cleansing force. It was just another layer of deception. And this time, you weren't going to let it wash away the truth. The rain had lightened to a mist, a fine mist that hung in the air like a memory you couldn't quite touch. It clung to your skin, made your clothes heavier than they should have been, and blurred the edges of the world into something that felt unreal. You stood in the alley, your mind working over the tiny clue, the scuff mark on the concrete. It wasn't much, but it was something. A trace left behind by someone who had thought they could erase their presence entirely. Whoever had placed Clara's body here had left something else, something small and unintentional. You straightened up, your fingers still cold from the rain as you wiped them on your coat. The alley, now quiet, felt like it was holding its breath. There was something unnerving about the stillness of the night, the way the city seemed to have gone into hiding, as though it, too, was afraid of what was coming next. You didn't move right away. Instead, you lingered for a moment, letting the silence of the street fill you, letting the cold seep deeper into your bones. There were questions still unanswered, things you hadn't pieced together yet, but your mind kept circling back to the man who had approached you, the one who had asked for your help. You'd sensed something off about him from the start. His desperation had been real, but so had his guardedness. There was something he wasn't telling you, something hidden behind his eyes that made you uneasy. He had come to you with a story, yes, but what was his real connection to this? Why had he sought you out, a detective who had long since given up on cases like these? You walked back toward the street, your steps slow and deliberate, your thoughts trailing behind you like shadows. The city stretched out before you, its streets familiar and foreign all at once. Every corner, every building, every person seemed to hold some part of the puzzle, and yet, you were still standing at the edge of it, looking in without a clear way forward. The question gnawed at you. What had the man meant when he said Clara was connected to people who aren't easy to get close to? It wasn't the kind of thing he said about someone who worked a regular job, lived a quiet life. The man had said it as though it was an understatement, as if there was something more to Clara's life that he wasn't willing to reveal. Had she been involved in something dangerous? Or had she simply gotten in the way of something bigger? Your footsteps echoed as you made your way back to the diner, the place where the quiet had allowed you to think, where you had let your mind wander. The warm lights of the diner were a welcome contrast to the chill of the night outside. You pushed open the door, and the familiar bell above it jingled, bringing you back to the present. The smell of coffee and fried food hit you as you walked in, and for a brief moment, you could almost forget about the body, the rain, and the city's hidden corners. The waitress gave you a nod as you entered, her eyes only briefly meeting yours before she went back to wiping down a glass. The diner was empty now except for a few stragglers, a couple of older men nursing their drinks in silence. You made your way to the same booth where you had been earlier and slid into it, the worn leather creaking under your weight. You ordered another coffee, but you weren't sure you needed it. Your mind was already buzzing, restless. You could feel the answers drifting just out of reach, taunting you. The rain, the clues, the strange things about Clara's death, they all felt connected, but the strands were loose, disconnected. There was one thing you had learned over the years. When a case felt like this, when the pieces didn't fit, it usually meant someone was hiding something. You didn't have to wait long. Just as the waitress placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of you, the bell above the door jingled again. This time, it wasn't a regular customer coming in. You could tell from the way the door creaked, from the shuffle of boots on the floor, that someone had entered with purpose. You looked up, and your gaze immediately locked onto the man who had come to you for help. His face was drawn tight, his usual stoic expression replaced by something more urgent, more frantic. He didn't even look at the waitress as she greeted him. His eyes scanned the diner, settling on you with a focus that made your stomach tighten. He moved toward your booth, his footsteps quiet but deliberate. You didn't bother waiting for him to sit. You motioned for him to take the seat across from you. There was a silent understanding between the two of you now, a sense of unspoken tension that had shifted since you first met. He knew, just as you did, that there was more to this than he had told you. Without waiting for him to speak, you took a slow sip of your coffee, letting the warmth spread through you as you watched him settle into the seat. His eyes were shadowed now, darker than before, and you could see the way his jaw clenched, as if there was something he was holding back. He wasn't the kind of person who liked to talk about his emotions, and yet there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that told you he was close to breaking. "You know why I'm here," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He looked around briefly, as though afraid someone might be listening, but there was no one in the diner who seemed interested in anything but their own quiet worlds. You didn't answer right away. You didn't need to. You had been waiting for him to speak, to reveal more of whatever story he had buried inside him. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. There was a tremor in his fingers that he couldn't hide, something that told you he was more afraid than he was letting on. "I shouldn't have come to you," he said, the words coming out like they were forced. "But I didn't have a choice." The people Clara was involved with, he stopped himself, as though unsure how much he should reveal. His eyes darted toward the door again, his gaze flicking nervously before returning to you. They're not the kind of people you can get away from. And now, she's dead. Because of me. And because of what she knew." You sat back in your seat, the weight of his words settling heavily between you. You knew the moment he said that he wasn't talking about ordinary criminals. This was something else, something bigger, something that might explain why Clara had ended up dead in the alley, placed there like a message for someone who knew the rules of the game. But what game was it? What did she know? You asked softly, your voice steady despite the storm of questions raging in your mind. The man hesitated. His lips pressed together in a tight line, and for a moment, you thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was involved with people who don't leave loose ends. And Clara, she had a way of getting into things. She knew more than she should have. About the things they were doing, the things they were planning." His words were vague, his fear almost palpable, and you could sense that he wasn't telling you everything. But that was fine. You didn't need him to say it all. You had enough experience to read between the lines. You knew there was more to this case than a simple murder. Clara hadn't been just some innocent bystander, she had been connected to something, or someone, who had known how to cover their tracks. The fact that this man was involved made it clear that whatever they had been involved in wasn't something that could be easily solved by a few questions and a casual investigation. You leaned forward, your gaze unwavering. "Tell me who they are. Tell me everything." But he was already shaking his head, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I can't. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes flickering toward the door again. "You don't understand. If I say too much, it won't just be Clara they'll come after. It'll be you too." The warning hung in the air, thick and heavy, and you could feel the weight of it pressing down on you. For a brief moment, you thought about backing away, about telling him you were done. But you couldn't. You'd been in this game too long. You could feel the pull of the mystery, the need to unravel it. You knew you had no choice but to press on, even if it meant diving into something deeper, darker, and more dangerous than you had ever imagined. "Then help me understand," you said quietly. "Help me figure out what's really going on here. I can't help you if you don't tell me the truth." The man's face twisted with fear, and you could see the way he wrestled with himself. Then, in the dim light of the diner, he nodded, finally giving in. "I'll tell you everything," he whispered. The words hung between you both like a fragile thread, waiting to snap. The man's confession, though reluctant, had opened a door that led deeper into the shadows of the city, into the parts most people would rather ignore. But you couldn't back out now. You had been in this long enough to know that backing down was never an option when the answers were just within reach. And this man, despite his obvious fear, was offering you a key to something that had been hidden for too long. The question was whether you wanted to unlock it, knowing what might be on the other side. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. You could see the effort it took for him to stay calm, but there was no going back now. You had made your choice, and whatever this man had to say, It was the next piece of the puzzle. "You need to understand," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about Clara. It's about a lot of people who are used to getting what they want without anyone asking questions. They don't like to leave traces. And Clara, she was digging around in places she shouldn't have been." You leaned forward slightly, your eyes narrowing. This wasn't news to you. You had known from the moment Clara's body had been found that something more sinister was at play. It wasn't a random murder. It never was. But hearing it from this man made it all feel much more real, much more dangerous. "Who were these people, and what was she digging into?" you asked, your voice steady, though your mind raced with possibilities. Your instinct told you that this was bigger than you could imagine, bigger than a petty crime or a case of mistaken identity. The man wiped his hands on his pants, looking uncomfortable. His eyes flickered toward the door again, his paranoia evident in every nervous glance. "You don't understand," he muttered. "They'll kill me if I talk. They'll kill both of us." You didn't flinch. Fear had no place in your life anymore. You had seen too many people broken by it. You understood it, but you didn't let it control you. You kept your voice low but firm. "If you don't talk, it won't matter. You'll be dead either way, either by their hand or because you let this go. Do you really want that?" The man looked at you, his face pale, his eyes wide. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as if he had just sprinted a mile. For a moment, you thought he might get up and leave, running back into the safety of the shadows where he could hide from everything. But then something in him broke. The walls he had built around himself crumbled, and he slumped slightly, defeated. "All right," he whispered, voice cracking, "I'll tell you. But you have to promise me one thing." You didn't say anything immediately, just nodded. You couldn't promise anything until you knew what he was about to say. "You have to promise me you'll get out. Once you know the truth, they won't stop until they've silenced you. So if you want out, if you want to walk away from all this," he trailed off, shaking his head. "You can't play the hero with them. They don't care." You pressed your lips together, but inside, something shifted. He was scared. But he was also telling you the truth, in a way. You weren't sure if this was the last step in a case that would push you over the edge or if it was just another descent into madness. You didn't care. You had already made your choice. "I don't back down," you said simply. "I'll hear you out, but don't expect me to walk away." He nodded, seemingly resigned to the fact that there was no turning back. He stared at the coffee cup in front of him, lost in thought for a few moments before he spoke again. Clara wasn't just some nobody. She worked at a place, well, she did. A club, actually. You probably know it. The Black Lotus. It's a jazz bar, one of those places with all the right people, all the wrong people. You know the type, where the musicians play smooth and the drinks go down easy. He paused, his lips pressing tight as if he didn't want to say more. But it's not just a jazz bar. It's a front. For a lot of things. And Clara got too close. Your mind churned. The Black Lotus. You had heard of it, of course. It wasn't just another dive bar on the corner. It was an institution in the city, a place that served as a meeting ground for the city's elite, for the underworld figures who wanted to stay hidden in plain sight. There were whispers about it, always had been. But to hear it from him, to know that Clara had worked there, that she had been involved with people like that, made things feel darker. How did she get involved? You asked, keeping your tone calm, though your thoughts were beginning to race. The man swallowed, his gaze darting around the room before he spoke again. She wasn't a regular. Not at first. But then she started talking to people. Asking questions. You know the kind of people who come and go from places like that. You wouldn't think much of them. But Clara, she was smart. Too smart for her own good, maybe. She overheard something one night. I don't know what. But she kept pressing. Kept asking. She was getting closer. Closer than they liked. And when they realized it, they moved fast. You were silent for a moment, letting the information settle. Clara hadn't been some naive victim caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had gotten too close to something dangerous. The people she was dealing with, who were they? You pressed. The man hesitated again, his eyes flickering with hesitation. He knew more, that much was clear, but he wasn't ready to give it up. He didn't want to. Not yet. You're not going to believe it, he muttered, shaking his head. But it's not just the low-level thugs you think of when you think of the underworld. It's the people who run the city. The people in charge. The ones who don't get their hands dirty but pull all the strings. Politicians, businessmen, people with influence. The ones who think they can do anything because they've got money. And power. He paused, his gaze darkening. Clara, she was digging into something they wanted to stay buried. A deal. A corrupt one. She found out about the money laundering, about the way they were siphoning off funds from government projects. It wasn't just petty stuff. This was big. And she had the proof. You leaned forward, your interest peaked. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still so many gaps. Why hadn't anyone come forward before? Why hadn't she gone to the police? Why didn't she come to me, or someone else? You asked, trying to make sense of the fear and the secrecy that had surrounded her. He sighed deeply, his face creased with worry. Because if she did, she'd be dead right now. Just like she is. They don't care who knows. As long as it stays quiet. But Clara, she wasn't the type to be quiet. She had this way of making you believe in something bigger. She was brave, but that's what got her killed. You absorbed this new information, but it only made things more complicated. Clara had been murdered because she had uncovered a massive conspiracy, and now you were standing on the precipice, staring into the abyss. The question wasn't just about who had killed Clara, it was about what was going to happen next. Who would come after you for asking the wrong questions? And would you be able to finish what she had started, or would you end up another victim of the same system? You pressed your fingers against the table, your eyes narrowing as you studied the man in front of you. I need names. I need everything you know. For the first time since he had sat down, he didn't look so sure of himself. The weight of what he had just revealed seemed to have hit him all at once. His face paled, and his hands clenched into fists as if he were trying to hold himself together. I don't know everything, but I know enough to get us both killed, he said softly, his voice barely audible. That was when the door to the diner swung open again, and you both froze. The bell above the door rang sharply, cutting through the air, and you knew at once that something was about to change. The door creaked open with the familiar sound of a gust of wind and the soft jingle of the bell. For a moment, nothing happened. The two of you locked eyes across the table, the weight of the conversation hanging between you. The air in the diner seemed to thicken, and you could feel the temperature drop, though the warmth of the diner's dim light should have been enough to melt the chill that had settled in your bones. You didn't need to look up. You could feel the presence of whoever had just entered. There was something unsettling about it. Not a newcomer, not someone who was just looking for a warm meal. No, this person had an agenda. A reason for walking into this diner at this exact moment. The man sitting across from you, a man who had shared things that most people would never dare to speak aloud, glanced over his shoulder, his face paling even further. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time since you'd met him, he looked truly frightened. You turned your head, slowly, your instincts already on high alert. It wasn't the usual type of people who wandered into diners like this at this time of night. The man in the doorway was tall, sharply dressed, his posture stiff and purposeful. He wasn't just another patron. He had that air about him, the kind of air that made it clear he wasn't here by accident. His suit was black, well-tailored, and his presence was almost overwhelming, as if the air around him had shifted the moment he stepped through the door. You didn't recognize him, but you didn't need to. The way he moved, confident, deliberate, told you everything you needed to know. He was dangerous. The man you had been speaking to, your only lead, sat frozen in his seat, staring at the new arrival with a look of pure terror. His hand reached for his jacket, as if instinctively preparing to reach for something hidden there. Something to defend himself, perhaps. But you knew there would be no escaping whoever had walked in. The man in the doorway stepped forward, his shoes clicking sharply against the floor, the sound echoing in the quiet diner like a countdown. He was close now, close enough for you to make out the details, the slight gleam of a thin silver tie pin, the sharp cut of his jaw, the coldness in his eyes. He looked at you first, his gaze piercing, and then moved his eyes to the man sitting across from you, the one who had spilled his secrets. Is this the man, then? His voice was low, smooth, and controlled. He didn't sound like someone who was asking a question, but more like someone who already knew the answer. There was no warmth to his words. Only cold, calculated certainty. The man across from you didn't answer. He just shrank back into the booth, his hands suddenly clammy. You could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the sudden realization that he was no longer in control. This wasn't just a conversation about an unsolved murder anymore. This was something much darker. You could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on you. The man's presence in the diner meant something. He had been tracking you. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the right time to step in. But what did he want? Why was he here? For a moment, everything felt like it had stopped. The clinking of dishes in the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft buzz of the lights overhead, they all faded into the background. The only sound was the soft shuffle of his footsteps, now coming closer. And then, his voice broke through the stillness. "I'm afraid you've been asking the wrong questions, Detective," the man said, his gaze unwavering. "And now you've gotten yourself involved in something far more dangerous than you realize." You didn't flinch. You didn't back down. You had dealt with people like him before, people who thought they controlled everything, people who thought they could intimidate you into submission. But you had learned long ago that fear was a tool, and one you didn't use lightly. I think it's a little late for warnings, you said calmly, your voice steady, but every muscle in your body was now on high alert. You couldn't let fear take over, not now. You had come this far, and you weren't going to back down. The man's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I'm not warning you, detective, he said, his voice even colder now. I'm telling you how it is. He glanced at your companion, the one who had spilled his secrets. The man shrank further into the booth, his face ashen. The man in the suit looked back at you. You've done something that no one gets to do. You've started digging into things that should have been left alone, he continued, his voice smooth and unbothered, as though you were discussing the weather. Clara, the girl, she was a problem. But you, detective, you're much worse. You're a complication. You raised an eyebrow, your pulse quickening as you weighed the situation. This wasn't just about Clara's murder anymore. This was about something far bigger. You had become a target. You were in over your head. But you had no intention of backing down. Who are you? You couldn't help the words that escaped your lips. The question had been building in your mind for a while now. Who was this man? What was his role in all of this? The way he carried himself, so certain, so sure of his power, suggested he was far more than just a mere goon. No, he wasn't here just to threaten you. He was here because he had something to lose. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, savoring the moment as if trying to decide how much he wanted to reveal. I am someone who takes care of problems, he said finally, his eyes cold, calculating. And you, detective, are quickly becoming a problem I need to deal with. There was a tension in the air now, thick enough to cut with a knife. You could almost feel the pressure building, a storm ready to break. The man was sizing you up, trying to decide whether to take you out now or later. Your hand hovered near your jacket, near the weapon that you always kept close by, but you didn't draw it. Not yet. Not until you had a clearer picture. Is that so? You asked, your voice low but defiant. Well, I'm not the kind of problem that just disappears. I'm not going anywhere until I know what's going on here. The man's smile widened, though it was colder now, like a predator toying with its prey. That's what I'm hoping for. You'll know everything soon enough. But not yet. He took another step closer to the table, and suddenly you realized just how much danger you were in. The man had been watching you, following you. He knew everything about you, your moves, your next steps. The realization hit you hard. This wasn't just about a murder investigation. This was about power, about the lengths some people would go to in order to keep their secrets hidden. And you were standing on the edge of a cliff, unable to see how far down it went. You shifted your weight, preparing for whatever came next. You could feel the tension in the air, the electric charge that buzzed between you and the man standing before you. It was a standoff. And you knew, deep down, that something had to give. He leaned in slightly, his voice a low murmur. If I were you, detective, I'd stop asking questions. But I know you won't. So let me make it clear, you have no idea who you're dealing with. This city runs on shadows. And now, you're in them. Before you could respond, before you could even gather your thoughts, the sound of a car's engine revving outside the diner interrupted everything. The door to the diner slammed open again, and a figure stepped inside, their silhouette framed by the streetlights outside. The moment the figure entered, the man in the suit straightened, his demeanor shifting slightly, as though this new arrival had changed the rules of the game. It was clear now, something had shifted, and you were no longer in control. The moment the door swung open, the sound of the car engine cutting off in the distance still ringing in your ears, everything shifted. The man in the suit straightened immediately, his posture stiffening, the calm facade cracking ever so slightly. His eyes narrowed as they focused on the new arrival, the same predatory glint flashing in his eyes, but this time there was a flicker of uncertainty in them, too. It was a subtle change, but it didn't escape you. You weren't sure who this new figure was, but their mere presence seemed to unsettle the man you'd been speaking with, the man who had spilled his fears and secrets like he had been preparing for this moment all along. The balance of power in the room had just tipped. Whoever had entered had just made things much more complicated. The person who had stepped through the door was tall, like the man in the suit, but their movements were far less measured. They moved with an easy, almost careless confidence, as though the world had not just stopped around them but had adjusted itself to their will. You could see it immediately. This was someone who had authority, who knew how to command a room just by being in it. Their sharp eyes, however, seemed to take in everything at once. No detail escaped their gaze. The man in the suit didn't speak for a moment, watching this new arrival as they slowly made their way toward the booth. The air between them crackled, thick with tension. You, meanwhile, found yourself in a strange position. You were caught between two powerful forces, neither of which you fully understood. And you had no idea which one to trust, or which one you would need to survive. Your instincts were screaming at you to stand up, to move, to get out of the booth and make a move. But your feet were frozen. Every muscle in your body was locked in place, and though your mind raced, there was a strange calm settling over you as well. This wasn't a simple murder investigation anymore. This was something much more dangerous, much more lethal. And in that moment, you understood just how deep the rabbit hole went. The new figure took a seat across from you, their eyes scanning your face with an intensity that made your stomach tighten. For a brief moment, it felt as though they were looking right through you, reading every thought you had, every calculation you'd made up to that point. You didn't flinch. You couldn't afford to. But inside, your heart was racing, your mind scrambling for any bit of information you could use to make sense of the situation. Who were they? And why had they chosen this moment to appear? The man in the suit stood a little straighter, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I didn't expect you to show up here," he said, his words carrying an edge of surprise, but there was no fear in his tone. Only a calculated acknowledgement, as if he had just accepted an unavoidable development. The newcomer smiled, though the smile didn't reach their eyes. The situation had already been set into motion. "I'm not one for waiting around. You know that better than anyone." The words didn't make sense at first. They were spoken so casually, but the implication behind them was unmistakable. This wasn't a chance encounter. This had been planned. And you were the unexpected variable, the one who had walked into a game that had been in motion long before you even set foot in this diner. A sinking feeling started to settle in your gut. You had underestimated just how much you didn't know. The man in the suit, the one who had claimed to be a problem solver, glanced at you one more time before turning his attention back to the newcomer. I thought you had other plans for tonight. I wasn't expecting you to take an interest in this little matter. The newcomer laughed softly, a sound that didn't carry any humor. What's one more complication when there's already a mess to clean up? For a moment, you couldn't make sense of it. These were people who had a plan, a purpose, a network that ran deep, deeper than anything you had encountered in your years as a detective. They didn't operate in the same world you did. They weren't playing by the same rules, and every word they spoke was a calculated move in a game where you hadn't even been aware there were stakes. You sat still, waiting, trying to read the tension in the room. You needed to understand their dynamic. Who was in control? Who had the power here? The man in the suit? Or this newcomer? Let's cut to the chase, the newcomer said, leaning in just slightly, their eyes narrowing. You've been digging around in things you shouldn't be, detective. We've let you run your investigation. We've allowed you to think you were getting somewhere. But now, the situation has changed. You didn't blink, didn't react. You had expected this. You had expected that the more you pushed, the more dangerous things would get. But you hadn't realized just how close to the edge you were. The man across from you, the one who had been your lead, now seemed even more diminished. He wasn't just scared anymore, he was utterly deflated. His hands had stopped trembling, but there was a hollow look in his eyes. He was resigned to whatever was coming. This was no longer a negotiation. This was a game of survival. You'll get nothing from him, you said quietly, finally breaking the silence that had enveloped the table. Your words were direct, cutting through the tension. He's already given you what you wanted. There's nothing left to discuss. The newcomer's lips twitched, almost amused. You think that's the end of it? You think you've reached the limit of what we're willing to allow? There was a dark undertone to their words, and you felt a cold shiver run down your spine. You had only just begun to realize how high the stakes were. Clara's murder had been just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper you dug, the more tangled the web became. I've been in this game long enough to know when to stop digging, you said, your voice steady despite the storm that raged inside your chest. But I won't stop. Not now. The newcomer's expression shifted slightly, the smile fading just a touch, but their eyes remained sharp, calculating. You're making a mistake, they said quietly, leaning back in their seat, folding their arms across their chest. But you've already made it this far. You might as well see it through. But know this, it won't be you who decides when it ends. You took a slow, deliberate breath, pushing down the surge of adrenaline that threatened to overtake you. You had come this far. You weren't about to back down now. Before you could speak again, the man in the suit broke in, his voice laced with impatience. Enough of the theatrics, he snapped. Let's not waste time. This is bigger than you, detective, and you're out of your depth. You met his eyes with the same resolve you had always had, the same steely determination that had carried you through every case, every challenge. Maybe it's bigger than me. But I'm here now. And I'm not leaving until I get the answers I came for. The tension in the room thickened, and you could feel the weight of their collective gaze on you. There was a strange sense of inevitability hanging in the air. You were no longer just a detective on a case. You were a pawn in someone else's game, but you didn't plan on staying that way for long. You didn't know how, but you knew this wasn't over. You won't make it out of this diner if you keep pushing, the newcomer said, their voice cold and unwavering. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. The silence that followed was heavy. The air felt charged, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. You didn't know what that something was, but you were certain it was coming. And for the first time since you walked into this place, you didn't know if you would survive the storm that was about to hit. The storm that was already here. The silence in the diner was deafening. For a moment, it felt as though the world outside had ceased to exist. You could still hear the faint echo of the rain against the windows, the soft hum of the lights overhead, but everything seemed distant, as though you were standing on the edge of something deep and dark. Something that threatened to pull you in. You had made it this far, despite everything. Despite the threats, the shadows that loomed over you, and the tangled web of lies that had gotten you here. But now, it was clear. You weren't just investigating a murder anymore. You weren't just looking for answers. You had become part of the puzzle, one that was being carefully constructed and pulled apart by hands much more powerful than yours. The man in the suit stood across from you, his cold eyes fixed on you, measuring you up as if you were just another obstacle to be removed. The newcomer, the one who had shaken everything up with their arrival, sat back in their seat, watching you closely, waiting. For what? You weren't sure. But you knew they were in control, just as much as the man in the suit was. And then, there was the man who had been your lead, the one who had started all of this with his vague confessions and whispered fears. He sat between the two of you, his face pale, his hands still trembling, as if caught between two forces he couldn't understand and certainly couldn't escape. He was the catalyst, but now he was nothing more than a spectator, caught in the whirlwind of events that he had helped set in motion. You couldn't help but feel a strange sympathy for him. He had been running from something far bigger than he had realized. But now, there was no running left. There was no hiding. The newcomer's voice broke the heavy silence, their words low, almost casual, but they sent a chill down your spine. You've been digging in the wrong places, detective. The truth you're after, it's not the kind of truth that people walk away from. You're here now. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen. You've asked questions that weren't meant to be asked. You stared at them, unblinking, as their words sank in. This wasn't just about murder anymore. It wasn't just about Clara's death or the strange network of lies and shadows you had been unraveling. It was about something far more insidious, something that had been playing out behind the scenes long before you had even entered the picture. You had been a pawn in someone else's game, and now you could feel the invisible strings tightening around you, pulling you toward a fate you hadn't anticipated. But you weren't ready to give up. Not yet. Not now. You're right, you said, your voice steady despite the chaos swirling in your mind. I've seen enough to know this isn't just about Clara anymore. It's about power. It's about control. And I'm not walking away until I understand why. The man in the suit smirked, a thin, cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. You think you have a choice in this, detective? You think you can just walk away from this? You're already too far in. We've watched you. We've been watching you for a long time. His words echoed in the stillness of the diner. Watching you. You weren't sure if he was speaking metaphorically or if there was something far more sinister behind this statement. But either way, It didn't matter. You were here now, and there was no turning back. The newcomer let out a small, almost imperceptible laugh, their fingers tapping lightly on the table. The detective is right. You know. You can't undo what's already been done. This is far beyond just murder. The moment you decided to ask questions, you became part of the story. And now, there's no way out. You clenched your fists under the table, your knuckles white from the pressure. You could feel the adrenaline coursing through your veins, a sharp contrast to the strange calmness you had adopted in the face of danger. You knew what had to be done. You knew that the only way to end this, whatever this was to keep pressing, to keep digging, to keep moving forward. But you couldn't do it alone. Not anymore. You glanced at the man sitting next to you, the one who had been the source of your information, your only lead. His face was a mask of fear, but there was something else there now. Something softer. A trace of guilt. Maybe regret. You weren't sure, but you could see that he was no longer the man you had once believed him to be. He had been a part of something bigger. And now, that something was closing in on all of you. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken words, with unsaid truths that hung between you like an invisible barrier. The final pieces of the puzzle were right in front of you, and yet, you couldn't see them clearly. You knew you were missing something crucial. Something that would make sense of it all. But what? The man in the suit shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze flicking from you to the newcomer. The tension in the air was palpable now, as if everything was teetering on the edge of an inevitable conclusion. He was ready. You could tell. Whatever he had planned, whatever game he had been playing, it was coming to an end. And you were in the middle of it. You don't get it, do you? The newcomer's voice was cold, almost pitying. You spent all this time thinking you're going to uncover something, some truth that will bring it all to light. But the truth doesn't work that way, detective. The truth is never what you think it is. You felt a sudden tightness in your chest, a flicker of understanding dawning in your mind. The truth. The real truth. It was never meant to be uncovered. It had always been hidden, buried deep beneath layers of lies and shadows. And now, you were standing on the edge of it, unable to see where the darkness ended and where you would fall. But you weren't ready to fall. Not yet. You stood up suddenly, pushing your chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. The movement startled everyone at the table. The man in the suit, the newcomer, and the man who had been your lead all looked at you in surprise. But you didn't care. You were past caring. You were past being intimidated. Enough, you said, your voice low but firm. I've heard enough. I'm not going to sit here and be lectured about the truth anymore. If you think I'm just going to let this go, you're wrong. The tension was unbearable now, the silence stretching out like a taut wire, ready to snap. You could feel the eyes of both the man in the suit and the newcomer boring into you. They were waiting. But you had no intention of letting them take control of the situation. The final cigarette, the one that had burned itself down to nothing, was all that was left. The embers were still glowing, but there was nothing left to burn. You had reached the end of the line. And you had no more answers, no more moves to make. Except one. You reached into your coat pocket and pulled out your gun. The click of the safety being released was the only sound that broke the silence. everyone's eyes locked onto you. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath. And then, in that quiet, the storm broke. I hope you enjoyed tonight's story and that it helped you find a little calm at the end of your day. Remember, even in the quietest of moments, there's always something waiting to be discovered. The mystery of the night, the secrets hiding in the shadows, and the peace that comes when you let go of the world and just drift away. As you settle into bed, let the soft embrace of sleep take over and let your dreams guide you through the quiet streets where everything is still and all that matters is the next step into the unknown. Thank you for joining me here at the Cozy Storytime. May your night be restful and filled with the sweetest dreams. Good night, and I'll see you again soon.